For those of you who don't know, my name is Dr. Darja Kragt. I'm a leadership scientist and the founder of the Leading Lab. My passion and obsession is leadership, as you can tell. And as of, I think, this month, I've started running regular events called Leadership Chats with myself. And basically how it works, I just pick a topic that I feel is interesting and I can share something around leadership. And then I just talk to you about that topic for a bit. And there's also definitely time for questions and comments in this sort of the second half. So all in all, we shouldn't be here any longer than half an hour, which is the intended event time. Anyways, we'll get started. So the topic for today is on leadership schemas, or otherwise known implicit leadership theories. This is something that has many different names in research. As I've already said, it's at least two: leadership schemas versus implicit leadership theories. We can also call them leadership stereotypes, leadership prototypes. There's so many different ways. And so the intention today is that I just introduce you to what this concept is about and share some practical importance of it, and also give you some pointers as to, where to next. So if you're really interested, so what's your next step? So let's start with a little bit of a story, as I've shared in the description of this event. Leadership, or leaders, I should say, leaders are people that are often perceived to have certain characteristics. And specifically, we know from research and other daily observations that these characteristics are maleness, so being a male. Typically, it's also a particular race, so it's being white, and being of almost certain age, which is that sort of middle age, not too young, not too old. That comes with our idea of who a leader is. Last week, I shared a really interesting media story from a Daily Mail. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't, have a look. There was a really interesting choice by a journalist who was writing about a typical Australian boss. And the picture that was inserted into that story was a picture of a white, middle-aged male in sort of business attire. And the caption for that picture was that this is a stock image of a typical boss. And I said, well, how brilliant, because this is exactly what I want to talk to you about today. So if you imagine that sort of in front of you, that picture of those who have seen it or something similar, this is exactly what leadership schemas or leadership prototypes or stereotypes are. So the way that we understand them is we know that we hold a range of stereotypes about other people. So we stereotype pretty much on any known characteristics, so based on gender, on race, on age, on function, social class, the list goes on and on and on. What we often don't realize is that in similar way that we stereotype, say, females or older people, we also stereotype based on occupation, and leadership is actually one of those occupations as well. So when you think of leadership, you think of a particular stereotype that fits that occupational description. So ILTs, or implicit leadership theories, is essentially a list of categories that all describe leaders. So what are some of the things that we expect leaders to have? And the categories on ILTs are things like sensitivity, dedication, dynamism, creativity, intelligence, and then a range of other things, positive things, but also some negative things like tyranny, and things like autocracy, and also a part of more kind of negative stereotype around leadership is that idea of strengths and sort of masculinity in its kind of negative connotations. How do we know what these categories are? This research has been conducted over the last 30 or so years. Essentially what they did in really simple terms, they've asked lots and lots of people to write down as many words as they can think of when thinking about leaders. So imagine someone asks you, what a leader is, and asks you to write just as many words as you can. And then out of that, they generated a list of something like close to 900 different words, and that was essentially, categorized into 7 or 9 different categories, some of which I've already discussed, depending on the sort of the research that you look at. So why is this all important? Well, first of all, we know that when we are judging if someone is a leader or not, we will pretty much rely on this stereotype or prototype that we carry around, which helps us to then judge or decide if someone is a leader. So essentially how it works, imagine that you're walking into a room full of people. Let's say this is a group of people that are trying to achieve something. And then someone is expected to step up to the role of a leader in that group. So who is that going to be? Turns out that is going to be the person that is going most closely match the stereotype or the stereotypical information that all of us have. So when we look at leaders, existing ones or new emerging ones, we essentially always compare them to this stereotype that we carry around. So we sort of go, okay, well, this person looks in a particular way and is behaving in a particular way. That image of that person is aligned with what I think the stereotype of leadership is. And hence I decide whether this person to me represents leader or not. Of course, a lot of this processing is actually subconscious. So it's not like you go around and very consciously and deliberately think about who looks like a leader to you and who doesn't. But that happens all the time in your subconscious, and essentially that matching mechanism works all the time. If you perceive someone to be a leader and aligned with this stereotype, there's more chances that you are going to see that person as a good leader. There's more chances that you're going to be happy with that leader. There's more chances that you're going to be more engaged, and so on. So virtually any outcome that we care about in organizations is actually linked back to this matching of the stereotype. So what this means for leaders? Well, it's good news for those of us who fit the stereotype and are aligned with the stereotype. It's not so good news for those of us who don't fit that stereotype, because essentially, even if you are in the leadership positions, but you're not matching that stereotype, people are not going to see you leader-like. And again, this is not, consciously, this is not someone goes around and consciously thinks, oh yeah, this person is not someone. We'll just save the question till the end, okay? So let me just keep back on track to where I was. All right, and then the other thing I want to share with you around this research is that also there is this notion that the stereotype it kind of describes this really ideal, what we would call an ideal person, right? So in our heads, leaders are these perfect beings, or in a sense, who have all of these great qualities, such as being sensitive, being creative, being highly intelligent, being dedicated to their job, being dynamic, charismatic, and so on and so forth. And so in reality, we know that a real, alive sort of human is not going to be able to match that sort of level of perfection. Because, to be honest, like, we're all humans, we're all have our, strengths and weaknesses, we're all flawed to an extent. So what happens then is essentially we're putting up leaders in this position where we expect perfection from them, even though knowing that perfection is actually impossible, right? But we still hold them to this really high stereotype. And why this is interesting is because, to an extent, I think this explains to us why we hear so many comments, especially on this sort of more social media space, where people go and sort of say, well, I'm disappointed in my leader. I'm disappointed with how they come across. I'm disappointed in how they, behave. I'm disappointed how they treat me. Now, I'm absolutely here not discounting the fact that there are actually leaders or bosses out there that are not behaving in the right ways. But if you are, and if you're even trying your absolute very best, you should be aware as a leader that there's still potential that people around you are going to not perceive you as, very good. So you might still be good, but very good, just because they carry around this absolutely impossible image of a perfect leader that no one will ever be going to be able to attain. Okay. Right. So the final thing I'm going to share with you, before I see if there's any questions, is how do you know what your leadership stereotype is? This is the most interesting part. There is a research validated assessment where you can go through these categories and the different adjectives that describe them and complete for yourself to see what your own ideal prototype is. And I am going to give the link to this assessment, and I'm going to post it in the event comments today after we conclude. So I've prepared that assessment, and all of you can go and download. It's a very simple thing. It's a one page. You just go through, all the instructions are there. You can use it for yourselves and rate yourself on your kind of ideal stereotype and see what comes up. There's also some questions, and the questions that you can start thinking about when you're doing this assessment around, well, what does this mean that I have this stereotype of a leader, and how it affects me, and how it potentially affects my interactions. So if you are a leader, how does that affect your interactions with your team? If you're not a leader, if you have one, you can think about how it affects the way that you perceive your leader and what you, how you see them. So that's sort of roughly what I wanted to talk or briefly talk about to you and what I wanted to share. I'm happy to see if there are any questions or comments. Or I think it's really interesting that you mentioned trust, because trust is a big topic in leadership, right? Especially lately, somehow everyone seems to be talking about trust again. And yeah, well, trust is one of those things that comes and goes, right? But what is really interesting is that if you look into research on where does the trust come from? Like, how do we form trusting relationships with people, especially in the leadership context? That actually comes from similarity, right? So if I see you as similar to me, right? In the ways either obvious, like sort of the way that you look, the gender, obviously, like in this case, we're both of the same gender, your background, socioeconomic background, and so forth, even just the look, right? So age and things like that. But then also other things, so like that we share, experiences, right? So for example, at the moment we're sharing being here together. So something like that. In the workplace, obviously, it can be other things like having a family, or, living a particular part of town, or having gone to a particular school, or whatever it is, right? There's so many things. So the more that I see you as being similar to me, the more likely I am going to trust you, right? So yeah. So here's the kickoff with leadership, right? What I've talked about in terms of the stereotype. People who more likely or more closely match what I have as a stereotype of leadership, I'm going to more likely trust those people as well, because they already are similar to something that I hold inside my head, right? So this can be really useful because it's essentially, makes it quicker, right? So trust building becomes quicker because there's already kind of this basis for that. But where it becomes not so useful is if you don't really match that stereotype, people can actually take a lot longer to build trust with you as a leader, because it almost becomes like a barrier that's between you and your team, right? So it's still possible, but we're talking about this very quick sort of initial things that happen, right? So when you have a new team member or something like that. So yeah, so it has this huge influence on how we see leaders and how we see ourselves as leaders as well. And obviously, the whole point here is to kind of raise awareness of that and make people think a bit about that. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's not helpful to think of our workplaces as families, because it blurs the boundaries, right? We shouldn't, yeah. But also, like I said, there's a lot of dysfunctional families. It's like you don't want that dysfunction to be creeping over to the workplace as well. But yeah, great question. And yeah, as a sort of follow up and next steps, if you're really interested in this topic, obviously feel free to reach out and talk to me directly on LinkedIn or otherwise, and stay tuned for future events as well, which are coming up. And remember also that there will be a link to the assessment that I will post in the event comments, which you can then take on and have a look at and also do it and see what results you get. And I'll also be sharing a recording probably sometime later this week. So for those who couldn't make it here today and couldn't listen in, but yes, if you have any feedback or any ideas for future topics that you would like to learn about, or anything you would like me to consider, then also do let me know. And I thank you for being here today, and I hope that this very short, but hopefully you learned one or two things and taking away something of value. Thanks again for joining me today.